The mistreatment of women throughout history is a complex issue with roots in many factors: cultural, social, economic, political, and religious. This mistreatment has evolved over time, taking on various forms depending on the era, region, and society in question. To understand why women have often been oppressed, it's helpful to consider several key factors. 1. Patriarchy and gender norms. For much of history, human societies have been structured around patriarchal systems where power and authority are concentrated in the hands of men. Patriarchy is not just a system of governance, but a deep-seated cultural belief in the inherent superiority of men over women. These societal norms were built into the very foundation of many civilizations, where men were typically seen as the breadwinners, protectors, and decision-makers, while women were relegated to domestic roles. These gender roles were often justified through religious or philosophical teachings, which portrayed women as weaker, more emotional, or morally inferior to men. In some cultures, these ideas were so deeply embedded that they were institutionalized, creating long-standing systems of gender inequality. 2. Biological determinism and social control. In many societies, women's roles were heavily defined by their biological functions, particularly their capacity for reproduction. This led to the notion that women's primary purpose was to bear children and care for the family, a view that significantly limited their opportunities for education, career, or political involvement. In societies where land ownership, inheritance, and property rights were passed down through male lines, women's economic and social agency was severely restricted. There was also a belief in biological determinism, the idea that men and women were inherently suited to different roles because of their natural characteristics. This often meant that women's autonomy, physical freedom, and agency were curtailed to maintain social order, preserve male authority, and ensure the stability of family structures. 3. Legal and political disempowerment. Throughout history, women have often been denied basic legal rights. In many early legal systems, such as Roman law or the legal codes in medieval Europe, women were considered legal minors or property under the control of their fathers, husbands, or male guardians. They had few rights to own property, sign contracts, or make decisions without male consent. In many cultures, women were also excluded from formal education, politics, and governance, reinforcing the belief that women were unsuited for leadership or decision-making roles. The denial of women's suffrage and political participation was a critical tool in maintaining male-dominated power structures. Women's rights movements, such as suffrage campaigns, fought for centuries to change this. Religious and cultural justifications have played a significant role in the oppression of women throughout history. Many world religions, such as Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Judaism, have been interpreted in ways that reinforce patriarchal values. For example, in Christianity, the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden was often interpreted as a justification for the subordination of women, portraying her as the one who led Adam to sin and, by extension, as inherently more morally corrupt. In Islam, though the Quran advocates for the fair treatment of women, traditional interpretations of Islamic law, or Sharia, in some countries have been used to justify the limitation of women's rights in marriage, inheritance, and dress. Religious institutions often held immense power, and their interpretations were frequently aligned with the status quo of patriarchal authority, further entrenching women's subordinate roles. The economic structure of many ancient societies was based on manual labor and agriculture, where men performed the physical labor needed for survival. This division of labor also contributed to the unequal status of women. Men typically controlled the public sphere, such as politics, trade, and war, and had more access to resources, while women were confined to the private sphere, responsible for childcare and household labor. In industrial societies, women's labor was often undervalued, and many were relegated to lower-paying, exploitative jobs or worked without pay within the home. Even as women began entering the workforce in the 19th and 20th centuries, they often faced discrimination in terms of pay, job opportunities, and legal protections. Sexual violence and control. Throughout history, women's bodies have often been subject to violence, coercion, and control, reflecting the broader patterns of gender inequality. Rape, forced marriages, and sexual exploitation were often not just a result of personal violence, but also culturally condoned practices in some societies. In many cases, women had little or no legal recourse in the face of sexual violence, as their honor was often tied to their chastity and sexual purity, meaning that their worth could be compromised if their sexual autonomy was violated. The use of sexual violence as a tool of war, such as during conquest, colonization, or civil unrest, also targeted women as a way of humiliating and subjugating enemy populations. This kind of violence further reinforced women's vulnerability and marginalized status. Colonialism and global inequality. Colonialism and imperialism further entrenched the exploitation and oppression of women, particularly in colonized regions. European powers, for example, often imposed their patriarchal norms on indigenous cultures, disregarding or suppressing matrilineal systems or more egalitarian gender structures that existed before colonization. This, in turn, led to the further subordination of women in many parts of the world. Economic exploitation through colonial systems also disproportionately affected women, as many were forced into labor, either in the home, as domestic workers, or in industries like textiles or agriculture, where their work was undervalued and underpaid. Social movements and resistance. Despite centuries of oppression, women have fought for their rights and autonomy. Women's movements have emerged across time and space, challenging the status quo and advocating for legal and social changes. The feminist movement, for example, has played a pivotal role in advocating for women's rights, from suffrage to reproductive rights, labor rights, and gender equality in education. These movements have faced significant opposition and backlash from patriarchal institutions, but they have also led to substantial victories, such as the right to vote, access to education and healthcare, and legal protection against gender-based violence. However, progress has often been slow and uneven, with many women still facing significant barriers to equality. The mistreatment of women throughout history can be understood as a result of a complex interplay of cultural, religious, political, economic, and social factors, often rooted in patriarchal systems that saw women as subordinate to men. These structures were maintained through legal restrictions, gendered norms, and economic exploitation. However, women have always resisted and fought for equality, and the ongoing struggle for gender justice continues to challenge these entrenched systems of oppression. While progress has been made in many areas, much work remains to achieve true gender equality worldwide.